I was never much for believing in ghosts or the supernatural. My whole life had been grounded in reason, and even after my years spent in the war, I kept a tight grip on logic. I told myself that what I saw was always explainable, that whatever oddity I encountered could be rationalized away. But there's one event, something from my time in World War II, that I can't push aside, no matter how hard I try. It clings to me like the damp cold from a long winter night, and no matter what logic I apply, the feeling never really fades. The war, as you know, wasn't kind. By 1944, we'd been trudging through Europe for what felt like an eternity. The enemy had retreated back across France, and it seemed we were gaining ground, but every step forward came with a price. Men fell, supplies ran thin, morale. That was as brittle as a dried-out leaf. There was nothing romantic about it, nothing noble. It was a slow, grinding march of survival. Just make it to the next village. Just hold out a little longer. It was late autumn when we found ourselves in a small, forgotten village in the Ardennes. The war had passed through, though the village itself had been largely spared from destruction. I remember the sky gray and low, heavy with the promise of winter. We were tired. The few of us left in my platoon were running on fumes, desperate for some rest and shelter. The village seemed like salvation, though it turned out to be something far darker. The buildings were old, their stone walls thick and weathered from centuries of harsh winters. There was a sense of time to the place, as though it had existed long before any of us, and would continue to stand long after we were gone. Most of the houses had been abandoned. You could tell by the way windows were boarded up or doors had been left hanging open, but there was one building larger than the rest that caught our attention. It was a manor house, tucked slightly away from the main road. It stood on the edge of a dense forest that seemed to swallow what little light the gray sky offered. It was there that we decided to hole up for the night. The inside was surprisingly intact. Most of the rooms were untouched, and while dust and decay had started to creep in, it felt like the occupants had only recently left. We spread out, taking stock of what was available. There were some dry blankets, even a few pieces of furniture that hadn't been looted. The air inside was stale, but it was warmer than being out in the cold. We didn't question it much. We were soldiers, and when you're fighting a war, comfort is scarce. We didn't think about why such a place would still be standing, untouched, when all the others were shells. That first night passed in silence. We were too tired to do much more than sleep. I remember waking a few times, though hearing something in the distance. At first I thought it was the wind, but it was too steady, too rhythmic. It almost sounded like a whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. I chalked it up to exhaustion and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning I asked the others if they'd heard anything, but no one else seemed to notice. So I kept it to myself. The second night was colder. The fire we had going didn't seem to chase away the chill, and that sense of dampness returned. But it wasn't the sort you feel in your bones, it was something else, something intangible. The house felt wrong in a way that I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the old wood creaking in the wind or the faint sounds of animals scurrying through the forest. It was deeper than that, more personal, like the house itself was watching us, waiting. I started to notice small things. At first it was little movements in the corner of my eyeshadows darting along the edges of the walls. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the flickering of the firelight. Then there were the sounds again, this time clearer, whispers, but not the kind you hear in a dream. They were low, like voices carried on the wind. The words were still indistinct, but the tone. It was urgent, like someone was trying to tell me something I wasn't supposed to hear. On the third day, things started to unravel. We were supposed to move out, but a heavy fog had rolled in overnight, thick and unnatural. You couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you, and it clung to everything like a second skin. We tried to push through it, but after a few hours we ended up back where we started, standing in front of that manor. It was as if the village itself had become a maze, twisting and turning us around, no matter which way we went. That night I couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder, more insistent. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, watching the shadows dance across the beams. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, suffocating me, pressing down on my chest. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breathing shallow. And then, just as I was about to sit up, I heard it footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming from the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The others were asleep, scattered around the room. The fire had long since gone out. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for a moment there was silence. I held my breath, waiting, and then the door slowly creaked open. There was no one there, just the gaping maw of the hallway, stretching out into the darkness. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry, my voice trapped somewhere deep inside. I waited, listening for anything, but all I could hear was the faint rustling of the wind outside and the steady thrum of my heartbeat. Slowly, I pulled myself out of the blanket and crept to the door. I had to see for myself. The hallway was empty. The house was silent. I should have gone back to bed. I should have left it alone. But something was pulling me, leading me down the hall toward the back of the house. There was a door there, one we hadn't noticed before. It was small, almost hidden in the paneling. I reached out, hesitated, and then turned the handle. The door led to a staircase, spiraling down into the cellar. The air was damp, colder than it had been upstairs. My boots echoed softly against the stone steps as I descended, and with each step, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger. The walls were covered in strange marking symbols I didn't recognize, and at the bottom of the stairs there was another door. This one was locked. I don't know how long I stood there staring at that door, but it felt like hours. There was something on the other side, something I could feel as much as hear. A low, rhythmic sound, like breathing, or maybe it was the beating of a heart. I didn't want to open it, but my hand was already on the knob, turning it. The door swung open, and the smell hit me first damp, rotting, like something had been left down there to decay for decades. And then I saw it. The room beyond was a tomb. The walls were lined with bones, human bones arranged in intricate patterns, like some kind of macabre art. In the center of the room was a large stone slab, and lying on top of it was something. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it was human-shaped, though it didn't move. It looked old, impossibly old, like it had been mummified by time itself. And yet, I could hear the breathing, slow, steady, almost imperceptible. I backed away, my heart racing. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at that thing, watching for any sign of movement. And then it happened. Its eyes opened. They were empty, hollow like two black pits, and yet I could feel them staring into me, through me. A voice, no, not a voice, more like a presence filled my mind. It was ancient, beyond time, beyond anything I could comprehend. And it was hungry. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back up the stairs, or how I managed to find my way to the front of the house. But the next thing I knew, I was outside, gasping for air, the fog swirling around me. The others were already awake, confused, but I couldn't explain what I had seen. I couldn't make sense of it. The fog lifted the next morning, and we left that village without looking back. None of us spoke about what had happened. It was as if we had all agreed, silently, to forget. But I can't forget. I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness presses in. And I wonder if that thing, whatever it was, is still down there waiting. I wonder if it ever truly left me at all. I never thought I'd be telling this story, especially not now, so many years after the events that still haunt me. But as I sit here reflecting on my life, the memories are clearer than ever sharp, as if time hadn't dulled them one bit. They say age gives you perspective, but what it's given me is the realization that some things are too big to forget, too terrible to explain. It was the spring of 1943 when I found myself assigned to the intelligence division of the Allied forces. I wasn't a soldier on the front lines. I wasn't out there with a gun in hand, storming enemy bunkers or patrolling trenches. No, my job was quieter, less physically demanding, but mentally, it left a mark that I still carry with me today. I was tasked with gathering intelligence, analyzing captured documents, and sifting through radio transmissions for anything useful. In retrospect, I thought I was lucky to avoid the combat others faced, but what I experienced was far worse than any battlefield could offer. We were stationed in a small village in the heart of Poland, an area that had been devastated by war. The village itself was little more than a few crumbling houses and a church that had seen better days. Most of the locals had fled, their homes abandoned, leaving behind only the shadows of their lives. Our unit had set up camp in a nearby manor, a once grand estate that had been overtaken by the war, its walls cracked and windows shattered. It was the kind of place that looked as if it had never known peace. The manor had an unsettling air about it from the moment we arrived. The locals, the few that remained, refused to come near it. They avoided our eyes when we asked questions about the place, muttering something about its past, about the curse that had lingered long before the war. But we shrugged it off. Superstitions weren't uncommon in times of war, and we had bigger concerns than local legends. Our focus was on the Germans, on intercepting their communications, and on staying alive. At first, everything seemed routine. The war was pressing on, and we were doing our part. I spent long hours in the makeshift intelligence office, poring over maps and reports, my mind always occupied with the task at hand. The manor, with its creaking floors and drafty halls, became just another backdrop to the war. But as the days passed, a strange sense of unease began to settle over me. It was subtle at first, a coldness in the air that seemed to linger no matter how many fires we lit, or the odd sounds in the night that echoed through the corridors. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing more than the natural creaks of an old building. But there was one room, in particular, that I avoided. It was located at the far end of the manor, on the second floor, and unlike the rest of the house, it had been locked when we arrived. No one seemed to have the key, and after a few attempts to break in, we left it alone. There were plenty of other rooms to use, and no one thought much of it at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about that room. Every time I passed it, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the air around it was heavier, darker somehow. It was during one of those long, sleepless nights that the first real incident occurred. I had been working late, trying to decipher a particularly difficult transmission when I heard footsteps in the hallway. At first I assumed it was one of the other men in our unit, but the sound was different, lighter, almost hesitant, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I told myself it was nothing. Still, I got up and walked to the door, peeking out into the dimly lit corridor. There was no one there, just the empty hallway stretching out in both directions, the flickering of the oil lamps casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. I told myself I was imagining things, that the stress of the war was getting to me. But from that night on, the feeling of being watched never left me. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. A few days later, one of the soldiers went missing. He was a quiet man, not prone to speaking much. And at first we thought maybe he had wandered off, maybe even deserted. But when his body was found in the woods nearby, it became clear that something far more sinister was at play. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle, just his lifeless body, eyes wide open, staring blankly at the sky, as if he had seen something too terrible to comprehend. The medics couldn't explain it. Heart attack, they said. Fear can do that to a man. But I didn't believe them. Not really. The mood in the manor shifted after that. The other men became jumpy, paranoid even. There was talk of ghosts, of the cursed room, of the spirits of the dead who hadn't moved on. I tried to keep my head down, focus on the work, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the broken windows set my nerves on edge. And always there was that locked room at the end of the hall, waiting, as if daring someone to open it. One night I couldn't take it anymore. The constant dread, the feeling of something lurking just out of sight, it was too much. I decided to investigate the room. I wasn't a superstitious man, but the fear gnawing at me needed an answer. And I hoped that by confronting it, I could put the whole thing to rest. I took a crowbar from the supply room and made my way upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest as I stood in front of the door. It took more effort than I expected to break the lock, but eventually the door swung open with a groan that echoed through the manor. The room was pitch black, the air inside thick with the smell of damp wood and something rotten. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the contents of the room inch by inch. At first it looked like nothing more than an old storage room. There were crates stacked in the corner, an old wooden chair, and dust-covered furniture that hadn't been touched in years. But then, as I moved further into the room, the light caught something on the floor. It was a stain, dark and dried, stretching out from beneath the floorboards as if it had seeped through from below. Blood. I knew it immediately, even though it had long since dried and faded. I should have left. I should have turned around and closed the door, walked away and never looked back. But something compelled me to stay. I crouched down, running my fingers along the edges of the floorboards, and that's when I noticed the trapdoor. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but there, hidden beneath the layers of dust and debris. With a sinking feeling, I pried the trapdoor open, the hinges groaning in protest. The stench that rose up from the darkness below was overwhelming decay, rot, and something worse. I gagged, pulling my shirt over my nose as I shined the flashlight into the hole. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, but I could see enough to know that this wasn't just a cellar, it was a pit. There were bones. Hundreds of them, scattered across the floor in a tangled mess of limbs and skulls. Some were old, yellowed with age, while others looked disturbingly fresh. And among them I could see tattered remnants of clothing military uniforms, both Allied and German, all mixed together in a grotesque display of death. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the trapdoor as quickly as I could. But as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. I was trapped, the air in the room growing colder by the second. I could feel something moving in the darkness behind me, a presence that hadn't been there before. It was watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in terror, but eventually the door creaked open again, as if whatever had been holding it shut had decided to let me go. I didn't wait for an invitation. I ran, not stopping until I was back in my quarters, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind racing with the horrors I had just uncovered. The next day, I reported what I had found to my commanding officer, but when we returned to the room, the trapdoor was gone. The floor was intact, no sign of the bones, the bloodstains, or the pit. It was as if the room had never held any of the horrors I had seen the night before. No one believed me, of course. They chalked it up to stress, to the ravages of war playing tricks on my mind. And maybe they were right. Maybe it was just my imagination, a product of the fear and exhaustion that had consumed us all. But I know what I saw. We left the manor not long after that, the war moving us on to new assignments, new horrors. But that place, that room, has stayed with me all these years. I still dream about it sometimes, about the bones in the pit and the thing that lurked in the darkness, watching, waiting. And in those dreams, I know one thing for certain: whatever was in that room, it didn't leave with us. It's still there, buried beneath layers of time, waiting for the next unlucky soul to stumble upon it. I try not to think about what it was or what it wanted, but it's impossible to forget. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is silent, I hear the creak of floorboards and the soft whisper of something just beyond the edge of perception. It's like the manor's presence never fully released me. I'm never truly alone. After we left, I did my best to bury the memories deep inside me. I told myself it was just the war playing tricks on my mind, a hallucination born from exhaustion and fear. But deep down, I knew it was real. I kept working in intelligence, moving from one assignment to another, but I never found another place like that manor. I should have felt relieved, but instead, a part of me felt like I had left something unfinished, like I had escaped when I wasn't supposed to. I tried to forget about the soldier who died, about the strange things that had happened, but it wasn't easy. In the quiet moments when the war wasn't pressing on my mind, I thought about that pit, those bones, and how they seemed to reach out to me in the dark. There had been too many uniforms, too many bodies for it to be some isolated incident. It was a mass grave, a hidden secret that no one wanted to acknowledge. After the war ended, I returned home, trying to rebuild my life in the relative peace that followed. The years passed, and on the surface I moved on. I married, had children, and built a career that kept me far from the horrors of the past. But the dreams never stopped. At first they came infrequently, once or twice a year, just enough to disturb my sleep but not enough to take over my life. But as I grew older, they became more frequent, more vivid. Each time I found myself back in that room, standing over the trapdoor, knowing what lay beneath and yet powerless to stop myself from opening it. In the dreams, the pit is deeper than I remember, the bones more twisted and unnatural, and every time without fail, I feel that presence watching me. It's always just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the light, but it's there silent, patient, waiting for me to understand what I still haven't figured out. As the years went by, I began to wonder if that manor was still standing. I hadn't thought about returning, not at first, but something inside me kept pulling me back to it. I told myself it was just curiosity, the need for closure, but deep down I think I knew it was something more. It was like the manor itself had a hold on me, a tether that I couldn't break, no matter how hard I tried. A few years ago, after much deliberation, I decided to return to Poland. I didn't tell anyone about my real reasons for going. My family thought it was just a trip to revisit the places I had been during the war, to reflect and make peace with the past. And in a way, that was true. But in my heart, I knew I was going back to the manor. I needed to know if it was still there, if what I had experienced had been real. The village was even more desolate than I remembered. Time had not been kind to it. and the scars of war still lingered in the crumbling buildings and overgrown streets. But the manor was still standing, just as I had feared. It was in worse shape than when I had last seen it, its walls sagging, the roof partially collapsed, but it was unmistakably the same place. I stood outside the front gates for a long time, staring at the broken windows and the empty doorway. I had come this far, but now that I was here, I wasn't sure I had the courage to go inside. Part of me wanted to turn around, to walk away and never think about the manor again. But the other part of me, the part that had been haunted by it for decades, knew I couldn't leave without confronting whatever was waiting for me. The door was unlocked, hanging crookedly on its hinges. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sending a shiver down my spine. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay even stronger than before. It was clear that no one had set foot in the manor for years. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. I made my way through the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Everything was just as I remembered it, cold, lifeless, filled with a sense of dread that seemed to seep into my bones. And then, as I turned the corner onto the second floor, I saw it. The door at the end of the hall, the one that had been locked all those years ago, was ajar. I stood there, staring at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. It was as if the house had been waiting for me all these years, as if the door had remained closed until I was ready to return. Slowly I walked toward it, my breath shallow, my hands shaking. The room was dark, just as it had been before, and I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The air was colder here, the smell of rot almost unbearable. I could feel the floorboards groan beneath my weight as I moved further into the room, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. And then, just as before, I saw the trapdoor right where it had been, hidden beneath the dust and debris. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to run far away from this place and never look back. But I couldn't. I had come too far. I had spent too many years haunted by this room, by the memories of what lay beneath. I had to know. With trembling hands, I reached down and pried the trapdoor open. The stench that rose up from the pit was even worse than I remembered, a foul mixture of decay and death that made me gag. I shined the flashlight into the hole, my heart racing, and there they were, the bones, just as I had seen them all those years ago. But this time they were different. They were moving. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, that my mind was playing games with me. But as I watched, the bones shifted, clattering together in the darkness. They weren't alive, at least, not in the way we understand life, but they were moving, twisting and writhing as if something deep within the earth was stirring them, calling them back to life. I stumbled back, my mind racing, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. And then I felt it, the presence. It was stronger now, more tangible, like a cold hand resting on my shoulder. It whispered to me, though I couldn't understand the words. It wasn't speaking in any language I knew, but the meaning was clear. The manor had claimed many souls, and it wasn't done. Not yet. I don't remember how I got out of that house. The next thing I knew, I was standing outside, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the village, where I collapsed in the street, my body trembling from fear and exhaustion. I never went back to that manor. I never spoke of what I saw to anyone. But the dreams have only grown worse since that day. The bones, the pit, the thing that watches from the shadows, it's all there, waiting for me, just as it was before. I know now that the manor isn't just a place. It's a trap, a prison for the souls it has claimed. And I fear that one day it will come for me, just as it has for so many others. In the end, the war wasn't the thing that broke me. It was that house, that room, that unspeakable horror lurking beneath the surface. And no matter how far I run, no matter how many years pass, I know that I'll never escape it. The manor will always be with me, a reminder of the darkness that exists just beyond the veil of our understanding. And someday when the time is right, it will claim me too. I didn't join the war for glory or for patriotism. If I'm being honest, I was drafted like so many others, pulled into the whirlwind that was consuming the world. By 1944, we had been in Europe for months, and though we were all soldiers, none of us felt like heroes. We were exhausted, battered by the ceaseless grind of war. I served in a reconnaissance unit. Our job was to patrol, map enemy movements, and report back. On paper, it seemed straightforward, but in practice, it was anything but. That summer, our unit was stationed near the Eastern Front, in the dense forests of Poland. The land had already been ravaged by the war, whole villages abandoned, the forest reclaiming everything as if nature was eager to erase the marks of battle. It was beautiful in a way, but also haunting. Everywhere you turned, you could feel the war pressing in, an invisible weight that never quite left your shoulders. We were part of a small detachment tasked with scouting ahead of the main force. There were just 5 of us: Corporal Haynes, the oldest of us, and a no-nonsense leader, Private Marston, who always seemed to be on edge, Lieutenant Baker, fresh out of officer training and far too green for this job. And then there was Sanderson, my closest friend since boot camp, and me. The first few days were quiet, eerily so. We trudged through the woods, keeping low, keeping silent. We had heard that the Germans were moving through the region, retreating in the face of the Soviet advance, but we hadn't encountered them yet. The tension was unbearable. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us flinch. The forest was thick, claustrophobic, and we never felt at ease. Even during the day, the canopy was so dense that it was as if the world around us was perpetually locked in twilight. On the 3rd day, we stumbled upon what remained of a village. It was little more than a cluster of ruined houses, the roofs collapsed, walls blackened by fire. The air was thick with the smell of charred wood and decay. It was the kind of place you see once and never forget. There was a stillness to it, a silence that didn't belong. No birds sang, no animals moved. The place felt wrong, like it was frozen in time, caught in the middle of some unspeakable act. We spread out, searching for any sign of life, though by this point, we didn't expect to find survivors. Haynes was the first to speak up. "Keep your eyes open. This place might be deserted, but that doesn't mean we're alone." His voice was low, almost a growl, the war having long stripped away any softness. As we moved through the wreckage, something caught my eye tracks in the dirt, leading away from the village and into the forest. Fresh tracks. I called over the others, and after some quick discussion, we decided to follow them. The footprints looked like they belonged to a small group no more than 5 or 6 people, and they were recent. Too recent. We moved quickly, staying off the main path, keeping our heads low. It wasn't long before we started seeing signs that we were getting closer: a broken branch here, a scrap of cloth caught on a thorn bush there. But something felt off. The forest was closing in around us, and the deeper we went, the more oppressive it became. The light was fading, and with it, the uneasy feeling that something was watching us grew stronger. About an hour into our trek, we found them, or rather, we found what was left of them. The bodies were scattered, half hidden among the ferns and undergrowth. Civilians, by the looks of it, men, women, even a child. They had been dead for some time, their bodies bloated and rotting in the summer heat, swarmed by flies. Their faces were contorted in expressions of terror, frozen in their final moments. Bullet wounds riddled their bodies, close-range shots, execution style. There was no mistaking it, this was the work of soldiers. Marston turned away, retching into the bushes, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring down at the carnage. There were no signs of a struggle, no attempt to run. These people had been lined up and shot like animals, executed without a second thought. The war had brought out the worst in all of us, but this was something else. This was cold-blooded murder. What now? Baker asked, his voice shaking. He was trying to keep it together, but you could see the fear in his eyes. This wasn't what any of us had signed up for. Haynes crouched down beside one of the bodies, his face unreadable. "We bury them," he said quietly. "We can't just leave them like this." None of us argued. It was the right thing to do, but it wasn't easy. The ground was hard, and we only had our trench shovels, but we worked in silence, digging shallow graves for the dead. I remember the weight of the bodies as we moved them, the feel of their cold, stiff limbs. I remember the smell, God, the smell. It clung to my skin, to my clothes, long after we had finished. By the time we were done, the light was almost gone. The forest was growing darker, the shadows stretching long and deep. We didn't speak as we made our way back toward the village, the silence between us thick with unspoken fear. But as we neared the edge of the woods, we heard a single gunshot, echoing through the trees, followed by silence. We froze. Haynes held up a hand, signaling for us to stop. We crouched low, listening, straining to hear any sound. But there was nothing, just the wind in the trees and the distant call of a bird. For a moment I wondered if I had imagined it, if the horrors of the day had gotten to me. But then we heard it again, another shot, closer this time. "We need to move," Haynes whispered, his voice tight with urgency. "Now." We didn't need to be told twice. We moved quickly, slipping through the underbrush, our rifles at the ready. The shots were coming from the village. Someone, maybe the Germans we had been tracking, or worse, partisans, was out there, and they were getting closer. We moved in formation, careful not to make any noise, our breaths shallow as we approached the edge of the woods. When we reached the village, the sight that greeted us was worse than anything we had imagined. A small group of men in tattered German uniforms stood in the center of the village, surrounding something or someone on the ground. As we got closer, I saw what it was. Another civilian, this one a man, lying face down in the dirt. His hands were bound behind his back, and he wasn't moving. One of the soldiers kicked him hard, and when the man didn't respond, he raised his rifle and shot him, point blank. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the empty village, but the soldier didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring down at the body, his face a mask of indifference. None of us dared to move. There were too many of them, and we were outnumbered. If we fired, it would be a massacre, one we wouldn't survive. So we stayed hidden, watching in horror as the soldiers went about their grim task, rounding up the remaining villagers who had been hiding in the ruins. They were methodical, efficient. They didn't shout, didn't threaten. They didn't need to. The villagers were terrified, frozen by fear. One by one, they were lined up and shot. No trial, no questions, just execution. We could have intervened. Maybe we should have, but we didn't. Haynes made the call, and none of us questioned it. "We're here to observe, not to die," he muttered under his breath. And so we watched, helpless, as the soldiers carried out their gruesome work. When it was over, the Germans moved on, disappearing into the forest as if they had never been there. We waited until we were sure they were gone before emerging from our hiding place. The village was deathly quiet, the bodies of the villagers scattered like broken dolls across the ground. We didn't bury them. There were too many this time, and we didn't have the time or the tools. Instead, we moved on, leaving the dead where they lay, the forest slowly reclaiming them, just as it had reclaimed everything else. I've thought about that day often in the years since the war ended. I've wondered if we could have done something different, if we should have fought back. But deep down, I know the truth. We were just 5 men in a war much bigger than ourselves. We were powerless to stop the horrors around us, powerless to change anything. The war may have ended, but for me that day never truly ended. The faces of the dead still haunt me, their eyes staring blankly back at me in my dreams. I've tried to forget, to move on, but how can you forget something like that? How can you forget the coldness in a soldier's eyes as he executes a man without a second thought? How can you forget the fear in the eyes of the innocent, knowing they have no chance of escape? Those moments, those brief flashes of inhumanity, are burned into my mind. I carry them with me every day. After that patrol, something shifted in all of us. Marston barely spoke anymore, keeping to himself, staring off into the distance like he was seeing things none of us could. Sanderson and I tried to stay close, tried to keep things normal between us, but even our friendship felt strained. The war had changed us all, but after that day, it felt like the light had gone out in all of us. Corporal Haynes was the hardest hit. He'd been in the war longer than any of us, seen more battles, more death. He had a way of keeping things together, of grounding us when things got tough. But after the village massacre, he seemed colder, more distant. He stopped caring about anything beyond the bare necessities of survival. Just keep moving, he'd say, whenever someone tried to talk about what we'd seen. We're soldiers, we're here to survive, not save the world. But I think deep down, even he knew we weren't the same anymore. As the days went on, the oppressive weight of the forest never lifted. We continued our patrols, but each step felt heavier than the last. Every shadow, every distant sound brought with it a wave of unease. The forest wasn't just a backdrop to the war anymore. It was becoming a part of us, swallowing us whole, mentally and physically. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares. The image of that village, those innocent faces, was something none of us could shake. A week after we discovered the bodies, Lieutenant Baker, young and fresh, as he was broke down. He hadn't said much since that night, but his face had betrayed the fear in his eyes. One evening, as we sat around a small fire, keeping warm in the cool night air, he suddenly stood up and announced that he was leaving. "I can't stay here anymore," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't do this. I'll take my chances finding another unit or going AWOL. But I'm not dying out here." Haynes, sitting across from him, didn't even look up. "You walk out of here, Lieutenant, and you're a dead man." Baker shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "We're already dead, Haynes. Don't you get it? We're just walking ghosts, waiting for this goddamn forest to swallow us whole." None of us tried to stop him. We should have. We should have convinced him to stay, to stick together, but in that moment, all we could do was watch as he turned and disappeared into the trees, his footsteps growing fainter with each passing second until the night swallowed him. We never saw him again. Part of me wanted to believe he made it out, that he found another unit, another way to survive. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had taken him, just like it had taken so many before him. It didn't matter if it was German bullets, starvation, or the sheer cold isolation of the wilderness, he wasn't coming back. After Baker left, the rest of us stopped talking altogether. Even Sanderson, who had always been the optimist, grew quiet. We moved through our duties like machines, doing what was necessary to survive, but nothing more. We avoided the village, avoided talking about what had happened there, but it was always with us, like a shadow hanging over everything we did. The war was full of horrors. I saw men die in every way imaginable, blown apart by artillery, gunned down by enemy fire, even succumbing to illness in the trenches. But nothing stuck with me the way that village did. The sheer, senseless cruelty of it. The faces of those villagers lined up and shot like animals, left to rot in the dirt. That, more than anything, made me question what we were really fighting for. We were supposed to be the good guys, the liberators, bringing freedom to the oppressed. But in the end, we were just men, caught up in a war that seemed to strip away our humanity one day at a time. The enemy wasn't just the Germans or the Axis powers, it was the war itself. It turned us into something else, something darker, something unrecognizable. Eventually, our unit was reassigned, pulled back to regroup with the main force. We never spoke about what we saw in that forest, about the bodies we buried, or the men we lost. It became just another chapter in a long, bloody history, a memory we tried to bury alongside the dead. But I've never been able to forget. Even now, so many years later, I still wake up at night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I still see their faces, the villagers, and the cold, indifferent eyes of the soldiers who killed them. I still hear the gunshots echoing in the trees, feel the weight of the dirt as we bury their bodies. I still see Baker walking off into the woods, never to return. People like to tell stories about the war, about the courage and the bravery, about the victories that turned the tide of history. But those aren't the stories I remember. What I remember are the silences, the moments when we stood frozen, powerless to stop the horrors happening right in front of us. I remember the faces of the dead and the weight of the guilt we carried for leaving them behind. The war may have ended, but for me it never really did. There's no peace in victory, no comfort in knowing we were on the right side. All that's left are the memories of the things we did, the things we saw, and the men we lost along the way. And no matter how much time passes, those memories will always be with me, like ghosts in the forest, following me wherever I go.